So thanks everybody for joining today. I know we're probably short some folks and just want to underscore again that no, it's a really difficult day here in Vermont due to the flooding. So we'll be sure to share the recording with folks who are not able to join us today. And obviously behalf of VNRC underscoring Greta's sentiments that we're all thinking about folks who may be challenged right now due to the circumstances. But thanks to those of you who were able to make it today. I'm Jamie Fidel. I'm General Counsel and Forest and Wildlife Program Director with VNRC, and with me is Mary Perchlick, our Ecological Restoration Associate. And we'll be presenting today. And again, we're going to give lots of time for some questions at the end. So I'm going to go through this fairly quickly. What we'd really like to share with you today is some research that we've been doing over a number of years now on parcelization in Vermont. And so parcelization is the breaking up of land into smaller and smaller parcels. This happens through the subdivision process. And so we're not here to talk about, outright forest loss or forest fragmentation, which can occur as parcels are built out with development over time. What we've been tracking is a change in parcel status. So compiling information based on the grand list, which is information obviously collected for property tax purposes, but there are land classifications within that data set, which we've been using to track parcelization. The reason that we're interested in looking at this is it can be really helpful for a number of applications, both for land use planners, many of you at the municipal or regional level, folks that do conservation planning, general planning in the state, forest land, resource and management, looking at our housing crisis and where there are opportunities to understand sort of our trends in parcelization as it relates to smart growth. So there's a lot of different ways this data can be helpful. And we're going to walk you through both some new trends, and we're also going to show you a parcelization website. But at VNRC, we're concerned about increasing parcelization as it relates to some impacts to rural resource lands, forest land in particular, and obviously interested in promoting smart growth. But as this plays out over the landscape, it can have negative effects both on the ecological health of our landscape and also the ecological viability of parcels to be contributing to our working lands economy, depending on how it happens. So as we talk about parcelization today, this is by no means, to say that we shouldn't be addressing our housing crisis in Vermont, but just being aware of this information and how it can be useful to good planning in Vermont is really what we're interested in. And so this website, which we'll walk you through, is a tool that we will share with you so that you can access the data. This is data from the grand list, as I mentioned. We've also compiled information from the UVA, Use Value Appraisal, or Current Use Program in Vermont. The website allows you to look at change in Vermont based on some maps at different scales in the state, and allows for the generation of geographically specific reports. The website, here's the URL address for the website. When Mary does the presentation, she's also going to show you how you can back into it through VNRC's website. But if you just want to take a minute to grab this, it's vtforesttrends.vnrc.org. So this is actually the fourth round of reporting that we've done based on parcelization research in Vermont with a team of folks. The phase 1 report we put out in 2010 compiled parcelization trends from 2003 to 2009. And phase 2 looked at subdivisions in 22 case study towns. We tried to understand how much could we look spatially at where subdivisions were happening. Back in 2014, that was more difficult because we didn't have digital parcel maps yet, but it was an attempt to look at essentially where are the subdivisions being located, how can we best understand their placement in Vermont. That report is available. We'll tell you how to access all these reports that we've done. Then in 2018, we actually published a fairly ambitious report that looked at trends from 2004 to 2016. And now this phase 4, which we're just publishing now, is compiling updated the data. So it's now 2005 to 2020. So we now have an executive summary that's going to provide some helpful information of things that I'll be talking about today. So you can read that at your own time. Of course, I'd like to recognize our funders. This project over time has been funded by Vermont Natural Resources Council. This last phase, phase 4, was funded by the Forest Ecosystem Monitoring Cooperative. And then previous rounds of research funded by the Northeastern States Research Cooperative. Just want to recognize our partners and steering committee for this phase of the project, both an internal team at VNRC, critical consultants Deb Brighton and Brian Voigt. The website was developed through a previous round, but now updated, but Steve Sharp at the VCGI is who developed the website. And we have a number of statewide collaborators from various agencies, organizations, and institutions. I'd like to quickly talk about some of the uses and limitation for this data. As I mentioned, the grand list data is collected for property tax purposes. It's not meant to be collected for sort of understanding land use trends, but then again, there are land use classifications that's embedded in that process. And so it can be a useful tool at the macro scale, looking at macro trends across the state, just kind of stepping back and doing a deep dive. It may help as we show you the parcelization website that we have to actually identify areas that may be vulnerable to increasing forest loss or forest fragmentation in the future as parcels continue to get developed out after the subdivision process. But the website does not actually measure outright forest loss or forest fragmentation that happens on the ground. It's measuring changes in parcel classifications, both size and classification types for parcels. It's really good at helping to inform municipal and regional planning and conservation planning, sort of, the general ideas of strategies that we need in Vermont or at different scales, regional planning or local planning, and to target technical assistance efforts. But this is not really a tool to be used down at the parcel level scale or to conclusively estimate the exact percentage or acreage as to whether it's right. There's going to be some anomalies in the data. There are going to be some errors in the data and how it's actually recorded, whether a decimal place is put in the right spot. We've tried to do as much cleaning of the data as possible to look at these macro trends, but obviously the way that property tax classifications are done by listers is town by town. There can be inconsistencies across the state. So we just want to flag that there are some really good utilities for this data, and there are definitely some limitations. So just quickly, glossary of terms as we talk about some of the parcel data. So parcel, for purposes of this project, is defined as all contiguous land in the same ownership within a single town. And so if a parcel crosses multiple towns, that's actually considered to be 2 parcels. We look at the land type classifications. That's based on the listers and assessors handbook. And then the particular land types. So residential is a category that includes a number of different residential categories, which are listed here. Again, if you really want to study the glossary of terms, you could look at a previous phase 3 report that we did on this project, and we'll show you where you can find that report. But residential does include apartments and houses, year-round mobile homes, and it also includes seasonal properties that listers deem is suitable or appropriate or being used for residential purposes. So, sorry about that. So farmland is essentially operating farms with the buildings that are involved. Woodland is undeveloped land that is mostly wooded. This could include like a small deer camp. And then in other categories, basically a catch-all for a number of different categories, including utility, other miscellaneous open land that's not wooded or agricultural purposes. So there's a number of different catch-all that go into the other category. We mostly for this project have focused on really what's happening with residential, farm, and woodland and the trends there. Okay, so I'm going to share some news that's positive. I'm going to share some news that I think is maybe concerning from trends in Vermont. But if we zoom out in 2020, just over 70% of privately owned acreage in Vermont is still represented in what we consider to be larger parcels. So for this project, we really use 50 acres as sort of an arbitrary cutoff, but one that would say, if we look at large parcels, they have a greater ability to maybe maintain ecological or sort of economic integrity as far as ecological functions, being part of maintaining our working lands economy. As parcels become smaller and smaller, obviously it's harder to do active management or forestry on those parcels. Obviously, ecological function and integrity may become more compromised. But again, it's just an arbitrary delineation for purposes of this project. But we still have a lot of land in Vermont that, as far as acreage wise, that's represented in larger parcels. And so that's good news. That means we still have a lot of opportunity here in Vermont with our land use planning and our stewardship and conservation approaches to help landowners with the decisions they make in regards to their parcels, and especially the larger parcels. Okay, so here's the trend over from 2005 to 2020, based on those categories that I just mentioned. We are seeing an uptick in the residential classification. We are seeing a downward tick in both woodland and farmland, and the other category is rising. So residential and the other category rising, farmland and woodland decreasing. Woodland is seeing the largest decrease from a percentage perspective, 19.32%. So here are the numbers. The executive summary that I mentioned provides all this data, so you don't have to try and capture all this data now. It's available in the executive summary. You can see the percentage changes on the right side. I would like to mention that, part of the woodland decrease, a percentage, not a large percentage, but part of it does capture land that has moved into public ownership. So if a woodland owner, an owner who owns undeveloped forest land, has transferred ownership to the state, let's say for wildlife management area, the national forest through a conservation project, that's no longer on the grand list as woodland. So this negative decrease is not all just simply the fact that we've lost woodland as a land classification. That property may still be woodland, it's just in public ownership. The last time we did this in 2016, we estimated that maybe 12 to 15%. It's really difficult for us to know because the grand list doesn't actually provide that information. We'd have to compile all the conservation projects that have been done in Vermont to understand that. I just want to add that as a caveat to what's happening with the decrease in woodland. By and large, though, there's a very strong correlation to the uptick in the acreage change that we saw over this 15-year period, with close to 200,000 acres being added in the residential category and almost as much woodland being decreased. So we believe there is a very strong correlation to woodland actually changing in classification over to the residential category. What that means is now there's a house or there's infrastructure on the property. The use and intention of that property has changed from undeveloped forest land to residential. It doesn't mean the forest land is gone. It may mean that there's been some impact based on the development that's happened, some level of forest fragmentation. But again, this decrease in woodland does not mean that the forest land is necessarily gone. It just means from a land classification, it's no longer considered to be undeveloped woodland. It's now considered primary uses residential, and then there may be a lot of woodland still present on the property or forest land. Obviously, you can measure the change in farm and other here too. So then at the county level, it's really interesting. We've seen, a downward tick in woodland parcels across the state at the county level. And, a couple of counties are worth pointing out here. Windsor County saw a 37%, decrease in woodland parcels as a classification. Addison County, 36.8, Orleans County, over 31, and Caledonia County, close to 31%. So some noticeable declines here. Again, some of that may be due to some land going into public ownership, but by and large, a lot of this, may be land transferring over to residential. And if we look at the trends are similar for large parcels, greater than 50 acres. So if we want to look at what's going on with large parcels, and from 2005 to 2020, the amount of acreage in woodland parcels over 50 acres in size decreased by 18.2%. Again, some of that was due to land going into public ownership, but tracking the general trend that I was talking about before. Amount of acreage in farmland parcels over 50 acres decreased by 10% over the study period. At the county level, almost all counties experienced a decline in the amount of acreage in parcels over 50 acres in size. And certain regions saw significant reductions. For example, Addison County saw an 8.3% reduction, in Grand Isle County a 7.6% reduction. You can look at all that data in the Parcelization website, which we're going to show you how to access. So this is just giving you the percentage change over the study period time across the four categories. And so, as we see, like, for example, in the woodland category from 2005, we went from 25.65% representation down to 21. So overall, there's, you can see that the residential category applies to much more land in Vermont than the woodland or farmland or other. Okay, so this is looking at total acreage. So where is the acreage held when we look at different parcel sizes in Vermont? And again, some good news here. We've got a lot of acreage in Vermont that's represented in larger parcels. What we're able to quantify, though, is those larger parcels, there is a decline in total acreage, and what we're seeing is an uptick, and then the smaller parcels over time as far as the acreage, where the acreage is represented. And if we want to look at quantity, the overall amount of parcels that are represented in Vermont, the overwhelming majority of them are in smaller parcels. And so this is like parcel count, overall quantity of parcels that we have in Vermont. So it's just a different way of looking at the parcel data. And here's the really interesting, looking at sort of where is the highest percentage change in parcel sizes. And what we're seeing is this uptick in the 2 to 5 and 5 to 10 acre parcel sizes that we think is interesting. And we'd love to have a little bit of a discussion with you all about this. Does this relate to maybe some of the zoning districts that we have in Vermont? Think about the rural residential districts or agricultural residential districts that have, minimum lot size. And is that why we're seeing, such a higher rate of the 2 to 5 to 5 to 10 versus, let's say, the 0 to 2? Obviously, we can see here where we're seeing a decrease, but it's just really interesting to see where we're seeing the highest rate of increase in parcel size categories. This project also looked at where there are now dwellings associated with different parcel sizes. And so, what we could see here is that we have, a lot of dwellings that are going on new parcels in Vermont. We generally have a narrative in Vermont that we don't have high rate of population change. That's obviously, the past couple of years, we have experienced population change at rates we haven't seen before, based on COVID or climate migration, for example, or just continuing growing interest in Vermont. But we do have subdivision happening, and we do have dwellings or houses going in on parcels in Vermont. So as we need to address our housing crisis, this is just another helpful metric to look at, where are we seeing dwellings? What parcel sizes are we seeing them showing up at? And so you can see here that it's really happening in the smaller parcels where we're seeing the dwellings. So we also looked at data that relates to the current use program. I think many of you are familiar with the current use program. It is it's a wonderfully successful program in Vermont that's enrolled a lot of forest land and agricultural land. And for the landowners who do enroll, they have to have for forest land a management plan, and then property taxes are significantly reduced for enrolling in the program. And we wanted to look at what is the role of UVA playing in protecting large woodland parcels? And this helps to quantify that it does actually ensure or bolster the representation or maintenance, of woodland in Vermont. And so we looked at parcels that are over 50 acres in size, and 71% of the acres and parcels that were enrolled in the current use program remained in woodland. By contrast, only 60% of woodland acres and parcels that were not enrolled in the program remained in the woodland category. So they're more susceptible to change, for example, to the residential category. Also, we also looked at, out of all the available parcels in Vermont that could be enrolled, 54% remained in the woodland category that were not enrolled. And so there's just a way of highlighting the importance of the UVA program and the job that it's doing in maintaining woodland parcels more effectively than for land that's not enrolled in the program. We're also able to look at information in the current use program, for example, where the parcel sizes that are being enrolled, where's the growth, where are we seeing loss, tracking similar to the overall trends. You can see that we're losing the overall representation of larger parcels in the program, and we're continuing to have this uptick in smaller parcels. That's no surprise. That's probably as a result of a lot of the subdivision activity that we're seeing, where we're taking perhaps a large parcel and then creating a number of smaller parcels that can be enrolled in the program. 25-acre minimum threshold for the forest land category. We're just creating more parcels that are enrolled in the program, which does put maintenance strain on the administration of the program. So this is just helpful information for land managers and folks that work within the program, for the tax department, to just be aware of where we're seeing growth and where we're seeing diminishment by parcel size in the program. So I did want to share just very briefly that we have a case study that we did as part of this phase 4. A key partner of ours was Deb Brighton, invaluable partner in understanding our tax data in Vermont and how to utilize it for different applications and study. She devised a case study in Addison County to try and understand whether property transfer tax returns as a different data set could be used, and in particular use that to do more spatial examination. So to grow out perhaps a new tool for tracking subdivision that would have a spatial application. And so we looked at subdivisions from 2018 to 2021. We mapped those out, and there were 125 parcels over a 3-year period, mapped out the location of those parcels in Addison County. And we also wanted to understand, where are these subdivisions occurring? And so one helpful way of looking at that would be to look at the municipal plan, the Addison County's regional plan for the future land use map, and look at the different sort of classifications there of proposed land uses. It was really interesting that 68% of these subdivisions were located in rural or natural resource oriented land use areas versus those that would be slated for more concentrated development. We also were interested in looking at, where are these parcels located in regards to intact forest blocks in the state that are mapped by the Agency of Natural Resources. 91% of those subdivisions intersected with an area designated as a forest block. Now, there's different prioritizations within the Agency of Natural Resources forest block mapping. And so 43% of these subdivisions were partially located within what are considered to be the highest ranking priority blocks in the state. So again, this is just another trend that's really interesting as we look at where our subdivisions are happening and looking at the potential challenges that we have to maintaining the integrity of our intact and connected forested landscape over time. We're really hoping to build out this tool now that we saw a lot of success in Addison County. We'll be looking at opportunities to actually create now a statewide tool using the property transfer tax. That will take some time and resources, but that is a desire of ours as far as the next step for this project. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing and turn over to Mary, who's going to walk you through the parcelization website. and how to access the data.
Hello, thank you, Jamie. My name is Mary Perchlick. I'm an Eco-AmeriCorps Ecological Restoration Associate at VNRC and have been involved with this Phase 4 update. So I'll be taking you through the website, just orienting to it a little bit. Hopefully I'll be able to get through it. My Wi-Fi is not great right now because of the storm. So Jamie may have to take over for me, but hopefully not. So I will share my screen. And yeah, I'm just going to show you how to get to the parcelization website from the VNRC website. So this is the VNRC homepage. You're going to hover over our work and come down to healthy forests and wildlife. And then scroll past the news to the parcelization section, and then click this link at the bottom, visit the Vermont parcelization website. And that will take you to the homepage where we have a little bit of background and a little bit of framing of the issue. And I'm just going to show you around the website some important things here. If you go to the About section, you can see contact information for Jamie and important collaborators and funders for the project. If you come to the download section, you can download the raw data that's behind the Data Explorer and the reports that I'm going to show you in a minute. Right now it goes to 2016. We're hoping to update this data to 2020, but if you'd like the 2020 data, please reach out and we can get it to you. We also have a metadata sheet here that you can access, which has some definitions, explanations of the project itself. So it's a good way to get oriented. We have a trainings tab where we have past webinars from previous phases and where this recording will probably be. Then if you come to our reports tab, this houses the executive summary that Jamie was talking about earlier, as well as all of our past executive summaries and reports. Just taking a minute to load, but if you click these little arrows in the upper right corner, it will pop out the executive summary. If you'd like to read it, I highly recommend looking over it. It has some of our background and methods, key findings, and recommendations about what this research can do. So yeah, it's 11 pages, it has graphs. And then to go to our Data Explorer page, this houses our interactive reports that allow you to select and visualize a range of metrics. They're available at multiple geographical levels, so county, regional planning commission, and the state level, and from the years 2005 to 2020. So here we have some tips and tricks. First off, it's best if you load it in Google Chrome. So I would recommend using Google Chrome to look at this. All of the metrics and filters, the geography, year, metric type, and metric can be adjusted individually. And when you select a new type of metric, you'll see your previous selection down below. So you just want to make sure that all of your filters are kind of talking to each other correctly. And you'll just have to, you'll get accustomed to it. It'll make more sense when we get there, but just make sure that you're selected appropriate metrics for the type of metric that you're looking at. This has the instructions for saving and printing reports. This just points you to the metadata again if you'd like to look at definitions. And then one note on the colors, the reports are all kind of unique. They don't compare to themselves like as part of the report. So one color in one report may not mean the same thing in a different report. So just keep that in mind. Okay, so now getting into the first report, all the reports depict change over time in various ways. So if you're getting confused about all the metrics, you can just come back to this. I'm looking at change over time displayed in various visual ways. So to get us started, I'm going to select the years 2005 and 2020. I'm going to be at the state level, and I'm going to select acres and parcels by type. And this just gives sort of similar graph to I think some of what Jamie shared before, but you see our 4 parcel categories: farm, other, residential, and woodland, and then the acreage for both years selected. So we have a range of years and a range of metrics that you can look at any of these geographical levels. Moving to the second graph, this shows percent change over time. So I'm going to come to 2005 to 2020. I'm going to go to the town level. I'm going to come to metric type, and then I'm going to show acreage and parcels residential. And so this shows a map of Vermont, and it has transposed upon it the percentage change of parcels in this category. So each town has a value of residential acreage in 2005 and then 2020, and then the percentage change. So, and then those percentage changes are mapped on the map of Vermont. So you can hover over and see the exact percentage difference. The darker blue is a bigger increase, and the darker the red is the bigger decrease. You can also click on an individual town and see it highlighted. So you can see the start and end values on the right. And if you click it again, it will bring you back to the total list. So you can see all categories, either total acreage or for larger parcels. And you can also look at the use value appraisal program. So coming to the third graph, this shows some like changes by whole numbers. So if we select county, your 2020 parcel type, and then acreage and parcels in the woodland category, we can see a alphabetical list of the counties with the acreage of woodland parcels, and then over here it's ranked from most to least. And then this is transposed on the map with the darker red being greater number. So if we switch the year, we can start to see trends over time. So the scale changes as you go down, or as you go back in time. But you can see similar sort of statewide distribution. And then finally, if we look at our line graph, this sort of is an interesting way to display or to compare different geographies. So I've selected the Regional Planning Commission geography. Then if we go to use value appraisal program, and then we'll look first at percent of parcels in forest land UVA over 200 acres. So we can see this sort of general downward trend. If you know, it's a little bit confusing, so you can click on an individual line to highlight it, either there or on the legend. So if you want to see Wyndham, it will highlight that. And then click again to come back. And then if we switch to a smaller parcel size from like 25 to 50, you can see this sort of general upward trend. So yeah, this is available for parcel size, type, parcels with dwellings at all the geographical levels. So that concludes my sort of brief run through. Thank you all for listening, and I'll do my best to answer any questions you might have. Thank you.
So thanks, Mary. I will just say quickly before we transition and have Greta help us with any questions that we've gotten, that we are available to help you. You know, we're familiar with these different tools. And so if you have different applications you're trying to figure out, whether it's at the county or local level or statewide, and you're having trouble navigating the website, just please feel free to reach out and we can help you.
Thanks,
So Greta,
Mary.
yeah.
Yes. So it's light on the Q&A in the chat, but we did also get a few questions and comments ahead of time in the registration form. And I know, Jamie, you had said that maybe we could open this up to be more of a dialogue in terms of how all of you folks who are here with us today could see using this data in real practical application form. And one of the questions or kind of reasons for coming today that somebody provided ahead of time was about collecting data for a town plan update. So I'm wondering, Jamie or Mary, if you could share a little bit about how you would see this data to be useful as communities are looking at updating their town plans.
Sure, but that's really one of the intentions of making this data available is to help a municipality or, you know, regional planning commission with an update to a municipal or a regional plan. And so, you know, you can populate, you know, data in your background sections, whether it be through talking about, you know, changes in residential trends, or maybe in your natural resources section of your town plan, as far as, you know, changes that you're seeing to, let's say, woodland or farmland, you know, generally based on a decrease. You know, you can then talk in your town plan, you know, about things like Act 171, which many of you may have gone through that process, but that's, you know, was a change in statute that requires towns, when they're updating their town plan, to identify important forest blocks or connectivity areas and talk about strategies to minimize the fragmentation of those areas. Certainly this data could be useful to talk about, you know, a trend and change in, let's say, the extent of woodland acreage that may be available in or presented in your town as part of your background on Act 171 planning. Use value appraisal program, you know, if you'd like to document how much land is in your program, is in your town, that's another example. So yes, there's lots of ways to try, and I encourage you to go into the website and look at the data for your town, and then think about different ways it could help you with some updated information that's relevant to your town plan. I'm also noticing that we have some other VNRC staff here, and Katie Gallagher is our Sustainable Communities Program Director. So, you know, please feel free to weigh in if you have anything more you'd like to add on any of these questions. And I know we have other planners here, so we're meaning this to be also, you know, questions, but also like conversation. If folks see the utility of this data, this is fair game to sort of comment to this project and what you're seeing. Katie, anything you'd add?
No, not at this point. I think you guys did a great job covering it, but yeah, I'm curious to see if anybody has any questions specifically, how it might relate to local land use planning, because I think this is a really helpful tool to start diving into.
Looks like Deb in the chat is sharing that Bolton is updating their town plan, but having some issues with outdoor recreation and wildlife habitat. I don't know, Deb, if you wanted to come off mute and talk a little bit about that, or if you were just kind of sharing generally that was some issues that your town was experiencing in town plan updates.
Well, actually, I'd be happy to talk about it. We actually created the recreation study group, and I am on this. I used to be on the planning commission, and I actually did a lot of changing in our zoning regs during Act 171 to try and address some of this. But now we're finding, particularly since COVID, that we have been inundated with outdoor recreation enthusiasts who we're now trying to figure out, what can we do? What should we do? How do we find good data to be able to help justify conserving certain parts of town to protect wildlife? And I was just wondering if you have any recommendations on how we can do that in a way that doesn't piss everyone off. I know we're going to upset some people, but you know, trying to maintain neighbors is also really important. And so one of the things we're doing is creating a survey. I don't know if we're going to get to meet tonight because the town of Bolton is flooded, but you know, other than that, there's no challenges at all. So if you have suggestions or recommendations of things that we can do to help educate both the community, our residents, and enthusiasts on why this is important, particularly in terms of the whole parcel perspective. That was really long-winded. I'll be quiet now.
Yeah. One thing I'll mention, and I noticed this when I was preparing for this and looking at the parcelization data, is Bolton really jumped out at me just in regards to the change in residential classification. I think there was an 81% change from 2005 to 2020. So obviously Bolton is seeing, you know, a change in a lot more land being classified as residential, and then you're layering in, you know, other planning considerations like recreation planning, you know, other uses of land. And this project really isn't, I guess, best suited to deal with sort of the recreational challenges, other than maybe it can help you understand the extent of land that may be, you know, better suited or available, you know, to promote or have access for recreation in the future. Doesn't mean that if a parcel goes from, let's say, woodland to residential, that parcel still can't contribute to, you know, the trail networks. How to do it well from a planning perspective, I think is a conversation that's playing out statewide. I know there's you know, a lot of attention right now to both the positive nature of the recreational growth that we have in the state, but also, you know, some of the concerns of the overall build out that's happening. And so we've been part of statewide conversations about, you know, what are the best ways to improve or look at different, you know, planning efforts statewide, you know, for that, and the resources that are needed. You know, what's the regulatory role of Act 250 versus, you know, shifting to a different kind of plan at the municipal level. You know, I think that would be a whole other webinar that perhaps, you know, would be worthy of actually doing, because I know there's a lot of interest in this. But I guess the bottom line is, I don't think this tool can be so helpful in regards to that's a different conversation that needs to happen about the best, you know, strategies for doing sound recreational planning. But I'd encourage anybody else here who's closer to that. I know the Mad River Valley's got a very extensive effort, you know, looking at how to do recreation planning well through some grants. Encourage Josh or anybody else to jump in, or anybody else that's out there that's also looking at that issue.
Looks like Josh is connecting to audio, and then Paul's got a hand up. So Josh, maybe it looks like you're muted now, but you're on with us.
Thanks all. There's Sam, my coworker, and I are sharing one audio with two different videos at the same time. So I was trying to turn his off, turn mine on. So I think it works. But yeah, thank you, Jamie, for sharing some of that work. I mean, I think that the type of data that's being provided here is really key to help us wrap our minds around the types of changes that are being seen. And there's one, there's the anecdotal, the things that we see are changing, and then there's the data that's providing us insight into what changes are. And I mean, I've been, during this call and previously looking at the parcelization website and finding a variety of things that are just resulting in more questions, right? It's like, Wakefield's numbers went up and this other town's numbers went down, and what does that mean and where does that come from? So one, I just want to express my appreciation for the parcelization website and the continued effort on here, its fourth version of the report work that you all are doing. I think it's really important for our communities to have data and context for the types of changes that we're seeing. That balance of recreation, conservation, I mean, it's really the balance of all the different shared values that our communities have, and trying to figure out what is that the right balance for our communities. Again, I think having data, having dialogue, and coming to things with an open mind is the way in which we get there. The town plans and the regulatory structures that we have definitely are the structures that we use to implement our values. But things are changing and changing rapidly, and that's what the data is showing us. And I think that's the experiences that folks are having. We're having an engagement process here and a data analysis process in the Matter Valley called the Community Recreation Visioning Project, which seeks to understand more about our conservation efforts, our recreation efforts, and best practices to try to find a balance that works for this place. And the first step is data and internal conversations. The second part is a broader community dialogue. And that process is on the front end right now. But it's something that a lot of partners in the Matter Valley are spearheading beyond the Matter Valley Planning District, and it's really exciting. So I don't really have much to share as far as sort of the answers to any of these things at this point. But I'm encouraged by having good data and community members that are willing to engage in dialogue, and I think we'll get there.
Awesome. Thanks,
Thanks,
Josh. Paul, did you want to add something as well? And we have a few other questions in the chat.
Okay, just very quickly, just wanted to take Jamie up on his offer to comment on the recreation balance. Agency Natural Resources is well aware of this, and they've convened a work group. It's an internal work group right now. We've had one meeting so far this summer, but ANR is working on this issue statewide, and so all I can say is stand by. We're going to be coming out with some assistance to towns and planning commissions and so forth on this issue of recreation and private lands and that balance. So we're working on it in ANR. Thanks.
Thanks, Paul.
Thanks, Paul. That's great. And there was a question from Maggie, maybe for someone on the VNRC team or any other town planners here, but what types of changes in zoning regulations are most helpful when addressing parcelization?
That's a big topic, and I see Katie smiling. So maybe you want to run with that first, Katie?
Sure, and then you can add on anything. So yeah, this is really where compact development comes into play, and especially looking at strategies like conservation zoning districts can be a really huge help. And I think it's important also to just distinguish when thinking about those districts between rural residential and conservation or other natural resource related districts, because rural residential is often where, as this data is showing, we see a lot of these subdivisions happening either because the land costs are lower, there's a lot of different pieces there. But conservation and other natural resource specific zoning districts have been shown to be a really valuable strategy for reducing that impact of parcelization. And I also just wanted to point folks to another resource from VNRC that was put out several years ago, which is the Community Strategies for Vermont's Forests and Wildlife. And that has a number of different recommendations. And maybe Jamie, you can speak a little bit more to that.
Yeah, so Mary showed you where the Forest and Wildlife Program page is at VNRC. There's a number of helpful reports or publications at the bottom of that page. So there's the Community Strategies Guide that Katie was just mentioning that is chock full of different both non-regulatory or land use planning regulatory solutions through zoning or subdivision regulations to address parcelization or forest fragmentation. We also just recently published another report called Wildlife Considerations in Local Planning, where we actually looked at the progress that has been made across the state through municipal plans. And that really is addressing, wildlife or forest land habitat, forest land resources. But that report actually quantified and demonstrated that, as Katie was saying, a conservation oriented zoning district, like a forest reserve district, a wildlife overlay district, usually is much more effective in kind of, reducing the overall density of development or having land use general use standards or some kind of development review standard to address, let's say, fragmentation impacts. What we're seeing in Vermont a lot is the kind of catch-all rural residential or agricultural residential districts is where we're seeing a lot of subdivision activity. And those are the districts that tend to not have attention to, let's say, trying to minimize or at least just have good site design from an overall fragmentation perspective, let's say. And so there's some need to improve sort of as we build out in those areas, the pattern and how we're doing it there. Not to say we're stop development in those areas. That's not what this conversation's about, but it's about having good site design standards. So there's a lot of work that can be done both in the type of zoning districts that you employ, but then the standards and the kind of site design that goes into your standards for your general districts, especially where you're seeing more subdivision activity. So I'd encourage you to look at both of those publications. I think,
Great.
Yeah.
Maybe we have time for one more. In the definition section, Jeannie is wondering about a clarifying farmland, agricultural land that has buildings and not agricultural land without those improvements. What happens when there's a subdivision to separate working ag land from obsolete buildings? What is the designation of working ag land that doesn't have buildings?
Yeah, so I'd really encourage Jeannie to reach out to me so we can really dig into the extended definitions and maybe even look at the lister's handbook to really understand how that's treated. That a little bit, probably more of a technical question than we have time for at this moment. So I would suggest please reach out, Jeannie, and then maybe we have a couple minutes to answer the 2 or 3 other questions here.
Sure. So Mark is wondering, does an entire property become considered residential if a home is constructed on a woodland parcel, even if the property remains enrolled in UVA, except for the required excluded area? Does any type of development on a parcel change its classification regardless of UVA status?
Again, Mark, good question. I think that's also a little bit more technical. We may want to ask Deb Brighton to help with that. Somebody who's a little bit more familiar with how the listers treat this, but I'd imagine that the excluded land, if there's a dwelling on it, would most definitely be considered residential. But I see your point. If it's just the parcel is 27 acres, you have a house site, I think probably that's a really good question, actually, one that I'm interested in. Does that parcel, probably because there's a dwelling, would be classified as residential? And it gets back to my earlier point that it doesn't mean that there's not woodland on the parcel, even woodland enrolled in UVA, but there is a house site there. And so the parcel would be considered residential. Again, I wouldn't quote me on that because this gets into, we're taking the data and literally just converting it, to highlight. When you get into questions of how the listers handle that, it's a little bit, I think, too technical for us to figure out right on the fly right now, but good question.
All right. Well, Jamie, maybe we can put your email in the chat as well so that folks who have questions can follow up with you. There was one last question from Claire about if any towns have adopted road ordinances prohibiting residential driveway access permits on class 4 roads in identified forest blocks. Not
Another
sure.
really good question, and I'd ask anybody else here because we've got a lot of resources here. I would just quickly say that I'm not necessarily aware of a town that has adopted that strict of an ordinance, but I do know towns that have required review of residential driveways of roads of a certain length in identified forest blocks or of a certain distance. And so there are examples of that. Katie or anybody else here have any examples in Vermont of where it's been taken to this degree?
Something I've looked into, but haven't been able to find any towns that actually do this yet. But yeah, if anybody knows of any, please do share.
Again, I really want to encourage folks to reach out to us. We're always excited when we're able to publish sort of a new round of this, and we'd really like to hear from you as far as how is this data helpful to you? What are you seeing in the data too? If you read the executive summary and there's trends that are jumping out at you that we missed, we'd love to hear from you. There's a number of recommendations also in the executive summary that we didn't cover today, but a number of policy recommendations and just ways that we're suggesting we can continue our efforts to really understand parcelization trends in Vermont and have it be useful to you all out there in the land use or conservation planning world. And so again, I'd really like to thank Forest Ecosystem Monitoring Cooperative for funding this phase. Thank our awesome team of people that helped on this project, including Brian Voigt and Deb Brighton, Mary, and a number of other folks that were part of our steering committee. And of course, we do have one more webinar tomorrow on this topic, and these will all be available for you to review on the website, and we'll send it around as well. So with that, Greta, I don't know if we had anything else to close with.
I don't think so. Thanks everyone for being here today, and stay dry and stay safe.